Okay, Christa, this is my first time covering what is happening in Tibet in an interview. Could you start off by telling me a bit about why the ICT was founded?
Yes, ICT was founded 30 years ago in the United States, really to support the attempt of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to find a peaceful solution for Tibet. The Dalai Lama had made some proposals to find a negotiated solution, a meaningful autonomy for Tibet. And in order to support that work, the ICT was set up in the US. 10 years later, ICT opened an office in Europe, and that's where I'm working as Director Advocacy, also to support the same attempts by the Dalai Lama to find a negotiated solution for Tibet, also through advocacy work in Europe.
Okay, could you tell me a bit about your personal involvement with Tibet and the ICT?
Yes, I actually lived and worked in Tibet a little more than 30 years ago. I traveled to Nepal, met Tibetan refugees, and decided to study Tibetan language and go to Tibet. And I ended up in Tibet at a time when there was, when Tibetans were demonstrating against Chinese rule and demanding more freedoms, human rights, and also a solution to the situation in Tibet. And so I witnessed the demonstrations. I also witnessed the clampdown and became involved, of course, recording some of the events that happened. And when I left Tibet, I spoke to the United Nations. I gave eyewitness testimony of what I had seen in Tibet. We're talking about 1988, 1989,
okay.
That time.
Okay. This is a big question. Can you give me a summary of what the Chinese Communist Party have done to Tibet over the years?
Well, it's a big question, but I think if you look at Tibet now and the situation, you see, if I would put it, in a short form, that Tibetans basically have been in lockdown for over 60 years. I mean, we talk about lockdown now in the case of the pandemic that we're all experiencing, but Tibet is one of the most isolated, one of the most closed countries in the world. Basically, Tibetans cannot leave Tibet. They cannot move around freely. They cannot express themselves freely. Tibetans who live in exile, they cannot enter Tibet for family visits. Foreign diplomats, journalists, UN special rapporteurs cannot visit Tibet. And what you see is that Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion is systematically eroded and sinicized. And I think the latest example of that is what we just heard, that now even in eastern Tibet, Chinese authorities have ordered Tibetans to take down prayer flags. And I think everyone who's ever gone to Tibet or seen any image of Tibet, it's the image of these prayer flags, colorful flags, fluttering in the wind from hilltops, from rooftops, from monasteries. So it's just the latest in so many measures to basically erode the Tibetan culture and everything that's Tibetan.
There have been some big things happening in the US with legislation enacted in 2018, and I think maybe with the UN as well. Is that true?
Yes, I mean, just a few days ago, Secretary of State Pompeo, he imposed sanctions under the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. It is a piece of legislation that was entered into law in December 2018. And under the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, Chinese officials who are responsible for continuing the isolation, the restriction of foreign diplomats, American diplomats, and journalists and tourists to enter Tibet, will get individual targeted sanctions, such as visa restrictions to travel to the U.S., so a ban to travel to the U.S., and possibly also other sanctions. And every year, the Secretary of State, under this act, has to produce a report in which he names Chinese officials that will face these sanctions. And last week, this is what came out, a report. We don't know the names, but there are individual Chinese who are now facing sanctions over their responsibility for keeping Tibet closed. And 2 days after that, another set of sanctions was imposed also by Pompeo against a very important person, Chen Guangzhou. He is now the party secretary, so the highest person of the Chinese Communist Party in Xinjiang. He used to be in the same position in Tibet, and he is the man who introduced and tried out the surveillance and control technology that basically monitors every move that Tibetans make in and outside of the home, and also is now enforced in Xinjiang. He is now also facing individual sanctions. He and his family are not allowed anymore to enter the U.S., and also their financial, possessions that they have in the U.S. will be frozen. Their assets, sorry.
That's great news, isn't it?
It's very important news.
Yeah.
And it's also important, it's also interesting that that in Europe now the momentum for these kind of actions, for this type of legislation is building. Just a few weeks ago, on the 15th of June, an opinion piece was published in a number of newspapers in Sweden, in Belgium, in France, and this piece was talking about the need for this type of legislation in Europe, and it was undersigned by 57 members of parliament and members of the European Parliament from 19 countries. And you also see now that after this imposition of sanctions by Pompeo, there are statements of support from MPs from European countries who are basically saying that, if not the entire Europe could move towards such a legislation, but then at least a number of like-minded countries should now get together and look at the possibilities of having this targeted sanctions regime for denying access to Tibet.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. I was reading about that on the internet today. I think legislation, or the process of starting legislation in the UK, I think has already started, hasn't it?
Yeah, there is a bill that has been submitted by Tim Loughton. He is the chair of the All Parliamentary Group on Tibet.
You spoke at the UN recently, didn't you, Christa?
Yeah, I spoke at the Human Rights Council,
okay.
And of course it was a strange situation, the 44th session of the Human Rights Council, because due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were very few people there. But we thought it was important to continue to speak at the council, because it's one of the only places where NGOs and also Tibetans can speak in the presence of also the Chinese government and continue to voice their concerns about the human rights violations there. And actually, on the 26th of June, 50 UN experts, they issued a very important statement. I mean, these experts, they are special rapporteurs mostly on thematic issues like torture, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. They have been communicating with the Chinese government about their concerns about human rights abuses in Tibet and Xinjiang and, affecting other parts of China. But China has basically rejected all their assertions. It hasn't seriously engaged with these rapporteurs to come to a better situation. And now 50 of them have said, that the UN Human Rights Council needs to establish an impartial mechanism that investigates, analyzes, monitors the human rights situation in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and in other parts of China, and reports annually to the Human Rights Council. Now, this is unheard of, that these rapporteurs are taking a step like this. It's really unheard of in the history of the UN. It's very significant. It doesn't mean automatically that this mechanism is now there. That still has to go through the Council. The Council consists of states, and also China will most probably be a member of the Human Rights Council again as of September, so it will be very difficult, but it sends a clear signal that more and more people, and also people in positions of authority, are saying, enough is enough. Something has to happen. Okay,
Christa, bearing in mind what is happening with legislation in the US and the UK and other countries, and what's happening with the UN Human Rights Council, can you tell me what the work of ICT will entail in the short to medium term?
Well, the most important, the the real core of the work of ICT is advocacy work. Our offices around the world. We also have an office in Germany. There is an office in Brussels that works with the EU institutions. We work with governments, we work with members of parliament, we work with the United Nations, the different bodies on the different subjects to raise the issue of Tibet in all these different fora. And we will, of course, work on access to Tibet. I mean, the follow-up to what is happening in the US, but also advocating for a similar type mechanism in Europe, or supporting what is now happening in Brussels, the drafting of a Magnitsky type, that is an individual sanctions regime for human rights violators worldwide. Those type of regimes to be also applicable to what is happening in Tibet. The second issue we're looking at very closely in our advocacy is the succession to the Dalai Lama. The current Dalai Lama has just turned 85. He's in very good health, and he says himself that he will live for at least another 20 years. Mm. But the Chinese are claiming the right to appoint a successor to the Dalai Lama. Mm. And now more and more governments, for instance, I'm Dutch, the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs has said that according to the Dutch government, this is not, the Chinese shouldn't interfere in this process. This is a matter of religious freedom of the Tibetan people, and it's up to the Tibetan community and the Dalai Lama to determine who the successor of this Dalai Lama will be. And you see that following the Dutch minister's statement, now the German Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense, the Belgian Minister, they are also issuing statements like this. This is very important, that more and more countries come out. In the US, a very important piece of legislation, the Tibet Policy and Support Act, is now before the Senate. Also in that act, the succession issue is an important piece. The act says that Chinese officials who will interfere in the process of the succession of the Dalai Lama will also face individual sanctions. So that's another core of our work at the moment. And the third priority topic that we're advocating on is environment and everything that's happening in the around environmental issues. Tibet is very important when you talk about the global climate situation, because Tibet is the third largest freshwater reserve in the world, and because it is a high plateau, the temperature rise there is 2 to 3 times as much as the rest of the world. So the implications of what's happening in the Himalayan area, in the Tibetan plateau, they influence weather patterns, monsoon patterns, but also water for the surrounding countries. So that's another of our focus areas for our advocacy work. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about all these different assaults on Tibetan culture, Tibetan language, Tibetan religion. But I think if you look at the situation now, what is really at stake in Tibet now is the survival of the Tibetans as a people, their language, their religion, and their culture. That's the seriousness of the situation that we face.